reading right now? Is this happening?
Amara Washington stood frozen in the marble bathroom of a penthouse overlooking London. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the documents in her grip. The papers trembled as her dark eyes scanned the words over and over again, hoping they'd say something different. Blackstone Holdings, total assets £847 billion, CEO James Ashford, annual revenue £156 billion. Her whole body felt like it was vibrating. Her heart was pounding in her chest so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The bathroom, with its heated marble floors, its gold fixtures, its expensive soaps and lotions arranged on glass shelves, suddenly felt like it was closing in on her. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked like a stranger, a woman who didn't know her own husband, a woman who had married a man and lived with him for 16 months without knowing he was the richest person in the entire country. 16 months. That was how long she'd been sleeping next to a billionaire, thinking he was broke. 16 months of working 3 jobs. 16 months of skipping meals so they could afford rent. 16 months of wondering how they'd ever afford a house, how they'd ever have children, how they'd ever actually build a life together. And the whole time, her husband had been worth more money than most countries had in their entire GDP. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that he'd never told her. He'd watched her struggle. He'd held her while she cried about money. He'd let her believe they were building something from nothing together. And he'd lied about it every single day. Amara heard the front door of the penthouse open. She heard footsteps in the hallway. She heard her husband's voice calling out to her from the living room. "Amara, you home?" Her hand found the bathroom counter to steady herself. The documents were still in her other hand. The truth was still in her grasp. In a moment, everything was about to change. Amara Jackson had been living in London for exactly 14 months when she walked into the Crown pub on a Thursday night, looking for a job. She was 26 years old, with rich, deep brown skin that glowed even under the fluorescent lights of the pub, dark eyes that showed her intelligence, and a beauty that came from her quiet confidence rather than from trying too hard. She wore her hair in braids that fell down her back, and her American accent stood out against the British conversations happening around her. She'd moved to London from Chicago with a single suitcase and a scholarship for a master's degree in social work. The scholarship covered tuition, but it didn't cover living expenses. And London, as she was quickly learning, was one of the most expensive cities in the world. So she needed a job. Actually, she needed multiple jobs. The Crown was a traditional British pub in South London, the kind of place where locals came to drink warm beer and argue about football, where the walls were covered with dark wood paneling, and where the carpet smelled like it had been absorbing spilled drinks since the 1970s. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't trendy, but it was hearing. The manager, a gruff Scottish man named Malcolm, hired Amara on the spot. He liked her energy, he said. He liked the fact that she had good customer service experience from working at a coffee shop in Chicago. He didn't care that she had an American accent. Actually, he seemed to think it was an advantage. "You'll be interesting to the customers," Malcolm said, writing down her hours on a sticky note. "Americans always are. They tip better too." Amara took the job. She started working Thursday through Sunday nights, serving drinks and clearing tables. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decent money in cash tips, and she needed the money. Between her bartending job at the Crown, her daytime job cleaning hotel rooms, and her weekend job as a care assistant at a nursing home, Amara was working about 60 hours a week. She was exhausted most of the time. She barely saw her small flat in Clapham except to sleep. But she was building a life in London. She was making it work. And then, on her 3rd week working at the Crown, he walked in. His name was James Ashford. He came in on a Thursday night at exactly 8 o'clock, which was unusual because the Crown was mostly empty until after 9. He walked to a booth in the corner, the same booth Amara would later realize that he always sat in, and he ordered a whiskey neat. Amara didn't really notice him at first. There were plenty of customers at the pub, but over the next few weeks, as he came back every Thursday night and ordered the same drink, she started to notice him. He was handsome, not in a flashy way, but in a way that suggested he wasn't trying. He was tall, with rich chocolate brown skin and dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to be constantly observing the world around him. He had a close-cropped haircut that showed off the shape of his head, and a small, carefully groomed beard that suggested someone who paid attention to details. He wore simple clothes, jeans, plain cotton shirts, a sweater that had seen better days. Nothing about him screamed money. But there was something about him that commanded attention anyway. The way he sat, the way he looked at people, the way he read his newspaper like he was genuinely interested in every word. What fascinated Amara most was that he seemed completely alone. He didn't come with friends. He didn't check his phone obsessively. He just sat in his booth, drank his whiskey slowly, and read. He seemed comfortable with solitude in a way that most people weren't. For the first 4 weeks they barely spoke. Amara would bring his drink, he would say thank you, and that was it. It was a professional interaction, nothing more. But Amara was starting to notice things about him. She noticed that he always tipped well, but not so well that it was flashy. She noticed that he was kind to the other staff members. She noticed that when a drunk customer was being rude to another server, James quietly intervened and made sure it stopped. She noticed that he seemed sad, in a quiet way that suggested he carried something heavy. One Thursday night, about 6 weeks after he'd started coming to the pub, he asked her a question. Amara was wiping down the bar, trying to stay awake despite her exhaustion. She'd worked a double shift cleaning hotel rooms and had come straight to the pub without eating. She was running on coffee and determination. James watched her for a moment and then he asked, "Are you okay?" The question was so simple and so genuine that Amara felt tears prick her eyes. Nobody ever asked her that. Nobody ever noticed that she wasn't okay. "I'm fine," she said, turning back to the bar. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," James said. "I recognize that look because I've worn it myself." Amara paused. She turned back to face him. There was something about the way he said it, so honest, so real, that made her want to tell him the truth. "I'm working 3 jobs and taking a full-time master's degree," she said quietly. "I'm exhausted. I'm broke. I'm not sure I'm going to make it work, but I have to make it work, so I'm trying." James nodded like he understood completely. Because, as Amara would later learn, he did understand. "You'll make it work," he said. "I can see it in your eyes. You're not the type of person who gives up." It was a simple compliment, but it was the thing Amara needed to hear. After that night, something shifted. James started asking her questions. When he came in on the next Thursday, instead of just ordering his drink, he asked Amara about herself. Where was she from? What was she studying? Why had she moved to London? Amara found herself answering. Slowly, carefully, she started to open up to this stranger who seemed genuinely interested in her answers. She told him about Chicago, about growing up in a middle-class neighborhood, about her parents who were both teachers, about how she'd always wanted to help people. She told him about her dream to open a community center for at-risk youth in London. She told him about how scary it was to be alone in a new country, how exhausting it was to work so much, how sometimes she wasn't sure if she could keep going. James listened like she was the most interesting person he'd ever met. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details she'd mentioned weeks earlier. He was present in a way that most people never were. It took about 3 months of Thursday night conversations before James asked if she wanted to get dinner somewhere other than the pub. They went to a small Italian restaurant in Clapham. It wasn't fancy. No white tablecloths, no Michelin stars, no pretense. It was honest and warm and real. They ate pasta and drank cheap wine, and they talked about life. By the end of that dinner, Amara knew she was falling for him. They started dating after that. It was slow and steady and real. James didn't rush her. He took his time. He showed up consistently. He was honest about his situation from the beginning. "I'm not rich," he told her on their third date. "I work as a bartender. I've got a small flat in Brixton. I'm just getting by like everyone else. If you're looking for someone who's going to sweep you off your feet with money and luxury, I'm not that guy." Amara appreciated the honesty. It actually made her feel less alone in her struggle. Here was a man who was also working hard, also building a life, also trying to make it in an expensive city. They were on the same page. They were in the same situation. "I don't need money or luxury," Amara told him. "I need someone who understands what I'm trying to do, someone who gets it." James smiled at her, and in that moment, Amara felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. They became inseparable after that. James would come to the pub where she worked, and instead of sitting in his corner booth, he'd sit at the bar and talk to her during her shifts. Sometimes after her shift ended, they'd walk through South London in the early morning light, just talking about everything and nothing. James was different from anyone Amara had ever known. He was quiet, but not in a shy way, in a way that suggested he'd thought deeply about things and had real opinions. He was kind, but not in a people-pleasing way, in a way that suggested he actually cared about doing the right thing. He was mysterious, but not in an off-putting way, in a way that made Amara curious about him. He never talked much about his own family or his past. When Amara asked about his parents, he'd give short answers and then turn the conversation back to her. When she asked about his work at the pub, he'd say it was fine and ask about her classes instead. It was like he was deliberately keeping parts of himself private. But Amara didn't mind. She figured he'd open up when he was ready. She thought maybe he'd had a difficult past and wasn't ready to talk about it. Everyone had parts of themselves they kept hidden. Amara certainly did. 6 months into dating, James asked Amara to move in with him. They were in his small flat in Brixton, a one-bedroom that was barely bigger than a shoebox, with a kitchenette that was really just a hot plate and a sink, and a bathroom that you could stand in the middle of and touch both walls at the same time. It was tiny, and it was ugly, and it was perfect because it was theirs. "I want you to move in," James said quietly. "I know it's a big step. I know we haven't been dating that long, but I don't want to go to bed not knowing when I'm going to see you next. I don't want you working 3 jobs and being exhausted. If we live together, we can split the rent. We can save money. We can actually build something." Amara said yes. It was the easiest yes she'd ever said. The next 8 months were the happiest Amara had ever been. Living with James meant she didn't have to work as many jobs. She could cut back to 2 jobs, bartending and housekeeping, and focus more on her master's degree. She could actually sleep sometimes. She could actually eat regular meals. It wasn't luxury, but it was better. It was manageable. James was always thoughtful. He'd come home from his shifts at the pub and he'd make dinner for them. Nothing fancy, just simple things like pasta or rice and beans, so they could eat together. He'd listen to her talk about her classes and her dreams. He'd hold her when she was stressed about assignments or money or the future. And slowly, Amara realized that this was love. It wasn't romantic movies or grand gestures. It was someone showing up for you every single day. It was someone who made you feel less alone. 8 months into living together, James took Amara to Richmond Park on a Sunday afternoon. They walked through the park as the sun was setting, turning the sky orange and pink and gold. They found a bench overlooking a pond and they sat down. For a long time, they just sat there in silence, watching the light change. Then James got down on one knee. He didn't have an expensive ring. The ring was simple, white gold with a modest diamond that caught the fading sunlight. Later, Amara would learn that the diamond was actually flawless and the ring was more expensive than it looked, but in that moment, she didn't care about any of that. "Amara Jackson," James said, his dark eyes vulnerable and honest. "Will you marry me?" Amara started crying before he even finished the question. She said yes. She said yes over and over again while tears streamed down her face, and James pulled her into his arms. They got married 3 months later. It was a small, simple ceremony at a registry office in London. Amara wore a white dress she'd bought from a high street shop for £80. James wore a suit he'd clearly bought from a discount chain. They exchanged simple wedding bands made of white gold. The only people there were a few close friends: Amara's classmate Rebecca, who was her witness, and James's friend Marcus, who was his witness. That was it. No big family gathering, no fancy reception. Just two people who loved each other, making a commitment in front of the law and a couple of witnesses. After the ceremony, they went to a restaurant and had dinner. They laughed and talked, and Amara felt like her heart was going to burst out of her chest. She was married. She was married to a man she loved. They were building a life together. That night in their tiny flat in Brixton, Amara went to sleep feeling happier than she'd ever felt. She had a husband who loved her. She had a future that suddenly seemed bright and possible. She had someone in her corner. Marriage was harder than Amara expected. Not because she didn't love James. She did, desperately. But because the reality of their financial situation was more stressful than she'd anticipated. Both of them were working but barely scraping by. London was expensive. Rent took up most of their money. Food was expensive. Utilities were expensive. Everything was expensive. James was working longer and longer shifts at the pub. Amara was still working her housekeeping job and bartending. They were both stressed and tired all the time. They'd go for weeks without seeing each other because their schedules were so different. When they did see each other, they were both too exhausted to do anything except sleep. One night, 14 months into their marriage, Amara broke down. They were in their tiny flat, sitting on their even tinier bed, and Amara just started crying. Not the pretty kind of crying. The ugly, gasping, desperate kind of crying. "I don't know how we're going to make this work," she said through her tears. "We're both working so hard and we're still barely surviving. How are we ever going to save for a house? How are we going to have kids? How are we going to actually build a life? What if we're always going to be poor? What if this is just how it is?" James held her. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just let her cry into his chest while his hand rubbed her back. Finally, he said, "We'll figure it out. I promise we'll figure it out. I promise, Amara." His voice was so sure, so confident, that Amara believed him. She didn't know how they'd figure it out, but she believed that somehow they would. 16 months into their marriage, Amara was cleaning the bathroom in their flat when she found something. She was organizing the undersink cabinet, throwing away old bottles and cleaning supplies, when her hand knocked something at the back of the cabinet. She reached back and pulled out a leather wallet. It was a men's wallet. It was clearly expensive, real leather, quality craftsmanship. It definitely wasn't the kind of wallet that a bartender would own. Amara's curiosity got the better of her. She opened it. Inside was a credit card. It was black and sleek and definitely expensive. It had James's name on it, but underneath his name it said something that made Amara's breath catch in her throat. Blackstone Holdings Platinum Card. Blackstone Holdings. Amara had never heard of Blackstone Holdings, and James was a bartender. Why would a bartender have a credit card from some company she'd never heard of? Her heart started pounding. She knew she should put the wallet back. She knew she should just forget about it, but instead she did something she wasn't proud of. She snooped. She went to the small desk in their bedroom where James kept his important papers. She found a folder with his name on it. With shaking hands, she opened it. Inside were documents, official documents with logos and letterheads. She started reading them, and with every sentence she read, her world seemed to tilt more. James Ashford, CEO of Blackstone Holdings. Total assets, £847 billion. Current market value, £156 billion per annum. Holdings include technology companies, real estate, investments across Europe. Amara sat on the edge of the bed, holding the documents, and she felt like she was going to be sick. Her husband wasn't a bartender. Her husband was a billionaire, not just a billionaire, the richest man in the entire United Kingdom. And he'd never told her. All the time she'd been working 3 jobs and stressing about money, he'd been worth hundreds of billions of pounds. All the time she'd been skipping meals so they could afford groceries, he could have bought a neighborhood. All the time she'd been wondering how they'd ever afford a house, he owned properties worth more than some entire cities. And he'd let her do all of that. He'd watched her struggle. He'd held her while she cried. He'd promised her they'd figure it out, when the whole time he could have solved every single one of their financial problems with a phone call. Amara heard the front door open. She heard James set down his keys. She heard him walk toward the bedroom, humming softly like he didn't have a care in the world. When he opened the bedroom door, he saw Amara sitting on the bed with the documents in her lap. His humming stopped. His face went pale. And in that moment, Amara understood that everything she thought she knew about her marriage had been a lie. Amara has just discovered that the man she married, the man she thought was struggling just like her, is actually the richest person in the entire United Kingdom. He's a billionaire CEO who's been living a complete double life. But here's the question everyone's asking. Why? Why would a billionaire pretend to be a bartender? Why would he let his wife suffer financially? What is he hiding? And more importantly, is there a reason for all of this deception? Is there something about James that Amara doesn't know yet? If you're loving this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell right now. You don't want to miss any party of this story. What is this? Amara asked, her voice surprisingly steady considering that her entire body was shaking. James didn't move. He just stood in the doorway, staring at the documents in her hands like they were going to burn him. Amara, he started, but she cut him off. No, don't Amara me. What is this? She held up the documents. Blackstone Holdings, £1 billion. James, what the hell is this? James closed the bedroom door behind him and walked slowly over to the bed. He sat down next to her, but Amara moved away from him. She wasn't ready to be close to him. I need to explain, James said quietly. Yes, Amara said. Yes, you need to explain. You need to explain why you've been lying to me for 16 months. You need to explain why you let me work 3 jobs when you could have paid off all our debts with your pocket change. You need to explain why you watched me cry about money when you're worth nearly £1 trillion. Her voice was getting louder. She was starting to cry, but not the sad kind of crying, the angry kind. I found out my father had a company, James said slowly. Blackstone Holdings. I didn't grow up rich, Amara. I grew up normal. My father and mother were normal people, but my father was smart and he built this company. By the time I was born, he'd already made his money, but he wanted me to understand the value of hard work. He wanted me to know what it meant to actually work for something. Amara listened, but she didn't interrupt. So when I turned 21, my father made a deal with me. He said, here's your inheritance. Here's your access to the money. But if you want to understand who I am, if you want to understand what I've built, you have to work. You have to earn something. You have to know what it's like to build your own life. So you became a bartender? Amara asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You slummed it in a pub to understand the working man's experience. I became a bartender because my father told me to, James said. He said, work at a normal job for at least 5 years. Live on what you earn. Don't touch the money unless you're about to starve. After 5 years, if you still want to take over the company, it's yours. If you don't want it, you can give it away or do whatever you want. 5 years, Amara repeated. James, we're not even a year into marriage. According to what you're saying, you should have been working at that pub for another 4 years. I know, James said. I know I was supposed to wait, but then I met you. James turned to face her directly. His dark eyes were earnest and vulnerable. When I met you, everything changed, he said. I wasn't thinking about my deal with my father anymore. I wasn't thinking about proving something to myself. I was thinking about you, about building a life with you, about making sure you had everything you needed. Then why didn't you tell me? Amara's voice cracked. Why didn't you just tell me? We were going to get married. We were going to build a life together, and you lied about who you are. Because I wanted you to love me, James said. Not my money, not what I could give you. I wanted you to love me for me, and I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you wouldn't be able to see past the money. Amara stood up from the bed. She needed distance from him. That wasn't your decision to make, she said. That wasn't your choice to take away from me. I had a right to know who I was marrying. I had a right to know the truth about my own husband. I know, James said. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Amara. The anger. For the next several hours, Amara was furious. She yelled at him. She cried. She asked him questions and didn't like his answers. She wanted to know everything. When exactly was he going to tell her? What would have happened if she hadn't found the wallet? Would he have ever told her? James answered every question honestly. He'd planned to tell her, he said. He'd been working up the courage. He knew it was wrong. He understood why she was angry. But his answers didn't make Amara feel better. Nothing made her feel better. I gave up my entire life to move to London, she said at one point. I came here alone with one suitcase. I worked 3 jobs and exhausted myself. I stressed about money constantly, and you could have made all of that go away. You could have told me, hey, we don't have to struggle, we can have a good life, but instead you made me suffer. I didn't make you suffer, James said. You wanted to work hard. You wanted to earn your degree. You wanted to know you were building something real. I would have wanted those things anyway, Amara shouted. But I would have wanted them while knowing that my husband wasn't lying to me about who he is. She left the flat that night. She couldn't be around him. She went to her friend Rebecca's house and slept on her couch. She didn't even call James to tell him where she was going. She just left. Over the next few days, Amara didn't talk to James. She went to school. She went to work. She avoided him as much as she could. But her anger, while still present, was starting to mix with something else. Confusion, hurt, and underneath all of that, a question that she couldn't stop asking herself. Did she love James because of who he was, or did she love him because of what she thought he was? Rebecca was supportive, but she also played devil's advocate. I'm not saying what he did was right, Rebecca said, one evening when they were sitting in her kitchen drinking tea. But I am saying, don't you see why he did it? Because he's a liar, Amara said. Because he was scared, Rebecca said. He was scared that you wouldn't love him if you knew the truth. And honestly, Amara, I kind of understand that fear. You met a man who seemed to be on your level, someone who was struggling like you were, someone who understood what it was like to work hard. And suddenly, he's not that man anymore. He's someone else entirely. Amara didn't want to hear that, but she understood what Rebecca was saying. The truth was, Amara had been drawn to James because of the life they seemed to be building together. She'd loved him because he understood her struggles. She'd loved him because they were a team, fighting against the odds together. But now she was realizing something else. She'd also loved who James was as a person, his kindness, his intelligence, his quiet strength. And those things didn't change just because he was rich. The money didn't change who he was. It just changed the context of who he was. After 4 days of not talking to James, Amara went home. She found him in the small living room of their flat. He looked terrible. He hadn't shaved. He looked like he hadn't slept. He was just sitting on the sofa, staring at nothing. When he heard her key in the lock, he sat up. His dark eyes filled with hope and fear at the same time. "Hi," he said quietly. "Hi," Amara said back. "I've been miserable without you," James said. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that." Amara sat down next to him on the sofa. She didn't touch him, but she was close enough that she could. "I need to ask you some questions," she said, "and I need you to answer them completely and honestly. No more lies. No more keeping things from me." "Anything," James said. "I'll tell you anything." "Why didn't you stop working at the pub after you married me?" Amara asked. "You were going to have to tell me eventually. Why didn't you just tell me?" "Because I was scared," James said. "I was scared that once you knew, everything would change. You'd start to see me differently. You'd start to feel like I was taking care of you out of obligation instead of love. You'd feel indebted to me." "Did you want me to feel like you were my equal?" Amara asked. "Because keeping secrets from me didn't make us equal. It made me less informed than you. It made me ignorant." "I know," James said. "I know that now. I didn't know it then." They talked for hours. James told her everything. He told her about his father's deal. He told her about watching his father build the company. He told her about the pressure he'd felt to prove himself. He told her about falling in love with Amara and not knowing how to reconcile that with his father's challenge. And Amara told him how she'd felt, how betrayed she'd felt, how stupid she'd felt for not noticing the signs, how angry she was that he'd taken away her agency by not giving her the information she needed to make informed decisions about their relationship. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Amara said finally, "but I know I love you, and I don't think love goes away just because you're angry." James reached out and took her hand. This time she let him. The next morning, James asked Amara if she wanted to see Blackstone Holdings. Amara wasn't sure she did, but she was curious, and part of her wanted to understand who her husband really was. They took a car, a nice car which felt surreal to Amara, to a tall glass building in the financial district of London. James held her hand as they walked through the lobby. People recognized him. They nodded respectfully. They stepped aside for him. It was a different side of James that Amara had never seen. His office was on the 42nd floor. It had a view of all of London spread out below them. It was impressive and cold, and everything Amara expected it would be. But the thing that made Amara really understand James was what she saw on the walls of his office. There were photos of his parents, photos of him as a child, photos of the early days of Blackstone Holdings, and in the corner there were photos of Amara, photos of them together at the Crown pub, photos of them walking through London, a photo from their wedding day. "I spend most of my time at the pub," James said quietly, "or with you. This office used to be my whole life. Then you came into my life and suddenly this office was just a place I had to be sometimes." Amara understood then. He wasn't lying to hurt her. He was lying because he was genuinely conflicted. He didn't know how to be both versions of himself at the same time. Over the next month, Amara and James had to make some decisions about their life. James's executive team had been pushing him to step into his role as CEO full-time. His father was ready to step back. The company needed active leadership. But Amara had demands. "If we do this," she said to James, "if we're going to live this life, then we do it together. I don't want secrets. I don't want you living one life at the pub and another life here. I want one honest life. One real life. You understand?" "I understand," James said. "I want that too." So James quit his job at the Crown. He became the CEO of Blackstone Holdings full-time, and Amara quit her housekeeping job and her bartending job. She focused on finishing her master's degree. But most importantly, they started to rebuild their marriage on a foundation of honesty. Amara has learned the truth about who James is. She's angry, but she also still loves him. They're trying to figure out how to build a marriage that's honest and real, even with all the complications that his wealth brings. But here's what we haven't talked about yet. What does Amara actually do now? How does she handle suddenly having access to unlimited money? How does she adjust to being married to one of the richest men in the country? And what about the judgment she might face from people who think she married him for the money? What about the family members who might come out of the woodwork looking for handouts? What about the questions about whether their marriage is even real, or if it's just based on his wealth now? You have to watch episode 3 to find out what happens next, to find out if Amara and James can actually make this work, to find out if they can rebuild their marriage on a foundation that includes honesty, love, and the reality of his wealth. Leave a comment and tell me, do you think Amara should forgive James, or do you think the lie was too big? Now let's continue the story. The first week of James being CEO full-time was overwhelming. He was in meetings all day. He was on calls with people from all over Europe. He was dealing with business problems that Amara didn't even understand. And suddenly, the small flat in Brixton didn't make sense anymore. "We need to move," James said one evening. "The company provides housing for senior executives. There's a penthouse in Chelsea. It's..." "A penthouse," Amara repeated. "James, we had one bedroom. We had a bathroom the size of a closet. And now you're talking about a penthouse." "I know it's a lot," James said, "but the company expects." "I don't care what the company expects," Amara said. "What do you want? What do I want?" They argued about it for a while, but eventually they moved to the penthouse. It was beautiful and huge and cold, and nothing like the little flat in Brixton that had been their home. The penthouse had panoramic views of London. It had marble floors and expensive furniture, and a chef's kitchen that Amara didn't know how to use. It had a walk-in closet that was bigger than their entire old flat. It had everything. But it didn't feel like home. The hardest part about James's wealth wasn't the penthouses or the nice cars. It was the money. James gave Amara access to accounts. He told her to buy whatever she wanted. He told her money didn't matter. But it did matter. To Amara, it mattered. She'd spent her entire adult life not having money. She'd skipped meals and worn the same clothes over and over. She'd worked 3 jobs and barely survived. And now she had access to unlimited funds. It felt wrong. One day, about a week after they moved to the penthouse, Amara was out shopping and she saw a dress she liked. It was beautiful, a designer dress that cost £400. In her old life, that would have been impossible. She wouldn't even have looked at it. But now she could afford it. She could afford 10,000 of them if she wanted to. Amara bought the dress. When she got home, she tried it on in front of the mirror. She looked beautiful in it. It fit perfectly. And she felt like a fraud. She called James and told him what she'd bought. She expected him to be happy, to tell her she looked beautiful. Instead, she found herself apologizing for spending the money. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have spent that much. That was so much money." "Amara," James said gently, "you can spend that much money. You can spend 1,000 times that much money. Money is not a problem for us anymore." "But it feels wrong," Amara said. "It feels like I'm wasting it." This was the thing about being married to a billionaire that nobody talks about. It wasn't the glamorous part. It was this weird psychological thing where you couldn't adjust to the idea that money didn't matter. Everything changed when Amara's mother found out about James's wealth. Amara had been avoiding telling her family. She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want her mother to think she'd married James for his money, but it was impossible to keep it secret forever. So when her mother called, Amara told her the truth. There was a long silence on the phone. Then her mother said, "He's a billionaire." "Yes," Amara said quietly. "And he didn't tell you?" "Not at first." Another long silence. "Well," her mother said finally, "that's certainly something." Amara could hear the calculations happening in her mother's head. She could hear the way her mother was reassessing the situation. Amara had married a billionaire. That meant Amara was set for life. That meant her mother didn't have to worry about Amara struggling anymore. But it also meant something else. It meant that Amara's mother had questions. It meant that Amara's mother probably thought Amara's marriage was somehow less real now. It meant that people might think Amara had married James for his money, even though that was impossible. She hadn't even known he had money. "Mom," Amara said, "I need you to understand something. I fell in love with James before I knew he was rich. I married James before I knew he was rich. The money is just a complication." "A good complication," her mother said. "Sweetheart, a good complication." But Amara wasn't sure that was true. Over the next few months, Amara went through what she could only describe as an identity crisis. She was no longer the struggling grad student who worked 3 jobs. She was now a woman who had unlimited money and free time. She was the wife of one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. People recognized her when she went out. People were polite to her because of who she was married to. But was that who she was? Was she defined by her husband's success? She threw herself into finishing her master's degree. That was real. That was hers. She studied hard and wrote her thesis and graduated with distinction. But then what? She didn't want to work a regular job. She'd done that. But she also didn't want to just be Mrs. James Ashford, the billionaire's wife. So she did what she'd always wanted to do. She started planning her community center. She wanted to build a space where at-risk youth in London could come and get tutoring, mentorship, career guidance, and just a safe place to be. She wanted to create the kind of resources that she'd needed when she was younger. She wanted to take her own story and use it to help other people. James was supportive. He was more than supportive. He offered to fund the entire project. But Amara had a condition. "I need to run it," she said. "I need to make the decisions. I need it to be my work, not your work. I don't want to be a figurehead at a charity that my husband paid for." "I understand," James said. "And you're right, it's your vision, you should run it." 6 months after James became CEO, he did something that surprised Amara. He asked her to come to his office. When she got there, she found him sitting at his desk, looking nervous. "I've been thinking about what you said," he started. "About me lying to you, about taking away your agency. And I realized I needed to do something to show you that I understand, that I'm sorry, that I'm serious about being honest with you from now on." He handed her a file. Inside the file was a letter, not a normal letter, a legal letter. A letter that said James Ashford was dividing his assets. He was giving Amara 50% of everything, 50% of Blackstone Holdings, 50% of his real estate, 50% of all his investments. "What is this?" Amara asked, shocked. "This is me trusting you with my life," James said. "This is me saying, I don't want there to be an imbalance between us anymore. I want us to be true equals. I want you to have the power and the knowledge and the resources. This isn't guilt. This isn't trying to fix what I did. This is me trying to be the kind of husband you deserve." Amara stared at the papers. She was now legally a billionaire herself. She owned half of one of the most successful companies in Europe. "James," she said quietly, "are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure about anything," he said, "except that I love you." Amara threw herself into building her community center. She found a location in South London, an old building that had potential. She hired architects and designers. She created programs. She hired staff. She built something from the ground up, and she did it with her own resources, her own knowledge, and her own vision. James helped, but he didn't control. He offered advice when she asked for it. He facilitated introductions to people who could help, but he let her lead, and that made all the difference. The center opened about 18 months after Amara and James got married. On opening day, Amara stood in front of the building and she felt overwhelming pride. This was hers, not because her husband had built it, but because she had built it. She'd had the vision. She'd done the work, she'd made it real. And it was working. Young people were coming. They were getting tutoring and mentorship. They were finding pathways forward that they wouldn't have found otherwise. Amara was doing what she'd always wanted to do. Over the next year, Amara and James's relationship deepened in ways that they hadn't expected. They'd moved past the lie, not forgotten it, but integrated it. They understood why James had done what he did, and more importantly, they'd rebuilt their relationship on a foundation that was honest and real. James was spending less time at the office and more time with Amara. He was getting involved in her community center, not as a funder, but as a supporter. He was mentoring some of the young people who came through the center. He was finding meaning in that work in a way he'd never found it in the corporate world. And Amara had grown in ways she hadn't expected. She was a successful businesswoman now. She was running an organization that was changing lives. She was a thought leader in her field, and she'd done it while being married to one of the most powerful men in the country, which was actually incredibly difficult because she had to constantly prove that her success was hers and not his. But she did prove it. She made herself undeniable. One evening, about 2 years into their marriage, Amara and James were sitting on the balcony of their penthouse, looking out at London. The city was lit up below them, millions of lights, millions of lives. "Do you remember when you thought I was broke?" James asked. Amara laughed. "I try not to think about how stupid I was." "You weren't stupid," James said. "You were trusting, you believed what I told you. That's not stupid, that's the opposite of stupid." "I was naive," Amara said. "Maybe," James agreed. "But you know what? I needed that. I needed to be with someone who didn't see my money first. I needed to know that I could be loved for who I am, not what I have." "And were you," Amara asked, "loved for who you are?" "Yes," James said. "You loved me when you thought I was nobody. You stood by me when you thought we were struggling. That's real love, Amara. That's the kind of love that lasts." Amara took his hand. "I'm sorry I lied to you," James said. "I'm sorry for taking away your agency. I'm sorry for making you feel stupid for not knowing." "I forgive you," Amara said, and she meant it. She'd forgiven him a long time ago, but it felt good to hear him apologize again. It felt good to know that he understood the weight of what he'd done. "What now?" James asked. "What do you want our life to look like?" Amara thought about it. She'd built her community center. She'd created a successful business. She had a marriage that was honest and real. She had money and security and options. "Now," she said, "I think we should have a family. I think we should raise our children to understand both struggles and privilege. I think we should use our resources to help people who need help. I think we should live a life that means something." "That sounds perfect," James said. And he kissed her. Amara and James's story shows us something really important about love, honesty, and forgiveness. James lied to Amara. That was wrong, but he also loved her. And when she found out the truth, they didn't give up on their marriage. They worked through it. They rebuilt it. And they came out stronger on the other side. But here's the real question. Would you have forgiven James if you were Amara? People are divided on this. Some people think Amara should have left him. Some people think what he did was romantic, that he was testing her love. Some people think he was just being smart. But I think there's a deeper lesson here. And the lesson is this: in any real relationship, there will be times when you're angry at each other. There will be times when someone hurts you. The question is, are you willing to work through it? Are you willing to communicate? Are you willing to rebuild? Because real love isn't about never fighting or never hurting each other. Real love is about deciding that the other person is worth fighting for. Real love is about being willing to do the work. If you loved this story, please share it. Please tell someone about Amara and James. Please start a conversation about what love really means. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe now. I have more stories coming, stories about real people, real struggles, real redemption. Stories that will make you laugh and cry and think about your own life. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. I'll see you in the next story.